Hello everyone, my name is Reverend Dr. Chris Wilson, Senior Pastor at St. Andrew Christian Church, and this is going to be the beginning of a video series on the Gospel of Matthew. And it's a series that will be done in 6 sessions, and each session will be about 15-20 minutes in length. But thought this would be a way to share a biblical study with you in a new format, so I hope you will enjoy the series and enjoy some of the diving in we will do. The particular study that I'll be doing, the overall study is entitled Jesus as Rabbi through the lens of Matthew's Gospel. And so in today's study, the one for today, we'll be looking at the nature and purpose of a gospel. We'll be looking at how Matthew's Gospel is written. We'll be looking at Matthew's highlights in terms of how he identifies Jesus throughout the Gospel. We're remembering that Jesus was Jewish in this Gospel. He's not Christian. We have to remember that Jesus is a Jewish person and that Christian language doesn't come till much later. And so this is really a document meant for the early followers of Jesus, many of them that were Jewish, some that became followers of him that were Gentile. But remembering this is not necessarily a Christianized story that's being told. It's a story kind of told from Jewish eyes, which I think is important. We'll kind of look at the understanding or background of Jesus with that Jewish heritage. One of the things I think that's interesting about Matthew's Gospel, and Tom Long, who is a preacher and biblical scholar, says this: when you read Matthew's Gospel, there are 2 things to keep in mind. The first thing he says is, how do we add our new faith in Jesus to our Jewish heritage? The other, he says, is how do we incorporate our Jewish customs and legacy into the new reality of the Christian faith? And these would have been 2 things Tom Long said that those early followers would have been trying to incorporate into their faith. And so all this is wrapped up in Matthew's Gospel. It's thought to be the second Gospel written. Mark is thought to be the first Gospel written in terms of when it was formulated and put together. Matthew is about number 2 in the 4 Gospels we have in the New Testament. Matthew would be the second one put together after Mark. The nature of a gospel is interesting. When I think of the gospel itself, we have 4 of them in the New Testament. There are many other gospels that didn't make it in the Bible, but we look at the nature of a gospel itself. It's a unique genre of literature. It's part history, it's part evangelism, it's part a lot of things. It's a unique form of communication that was done in that early century style. Gene Boring, who is a biblical scholar, well-known biblical scholar, says this in terms of the genre of a gospel. A gospel is a literary work to interpret the theological meaning of historical events told in a particular historical situation. The word gospel itself, the Greek meaning of the word gospel, basically means good news. It is a document of good news. When it says the Gospel of Matthew, it's the good news according to the author of Matthew, or the good news according to the author of Mark. And so this Gospel of Matthew is a unique genre that is a theological telling of things that happened historically. So basically we're looking at a document that's not direct like reading a history book, but it involves history. But it's a theological telling of history. And so that's kind of the unique character of this particular Gospel of Matthew. And so we have within it, we have this genre of literature that is meant to creatively and persuasively invite you as a follower of Jesus to absorb that message. And the author wants you to believe that message. And not only to believe that message, but to live that message. It's a theological document written in such a way to reflect God's activity in the world through Jesus. Matthew begins really by approaching a Jewish audience. Matthew's Gospel, its intended audience is primarily Jewish people that were following Jesus. And it's not to say there weren't Gentile listeners to this gospel, or they weren't intended to be a part of the receiving of this, but its primary audience were followers of Jesus that had a strong Jewish heritage. And if all the Gospels, all of them have kind of Jewish qualities in them, but Matthew's Gospel probably has the deepest, richest qualities of Jewish heritage within it, which I think is interesting. So some of the things that are distinct to Matthew's Gospel as opposed to some of the other Gospels is its Jewish character. And so some of the things I want to point out in the Gospel that help us with that. If you were to open up Matthew's Gospel, one of the first things you find in Matthew's Gospel is a genealogy. I remember as a little kid opening up my very first Bible. It was just a New Testament Bible. And I was all excited to get my first Bible. And when I was able to read, I couldn't wait to read the New Testament Bible. I opened it up, and it didn't take me long to put the Bible back down. This person begat this person, and this person begat this person. It was this whole genealogy. This is what the Bible says. I don't have anything to do with this. But this genealogy that starts at Matthew's Gospel is intended to appeal to a Jewish audience. This person of Jesus that would have been controversial in nature, saying, this Jesus whom we are talking about is a Jesus deeply rooted and connected to the Jewish faith and to the lineage and to the heritage of Jewish people. And this genealogy goes all the way back to Abraham. And Abraham is kind of the end point of that genealogy is important because it's there that God and Abram developed that initial covenant of promise. Abraham is kind of looked at as that initial figure of formulating that covenant between God and God's people. And so for Matthew to start the gospel with this genealogy tracing back to Abraham all the way up to Jesus, saying this Jesus is not some rogue person that comes from outside to our community. He is one of us. He is a part of us in a significant way. Tom Long, who I mentioned earlier, says of Jesus who from the very beginning of Matthew's gospel is the Messiah, and is now seen to also not only be the Messiah for Jewish people, but the Lord of all people. But it begins with Jesus being the Messiah, a person that draws all people to God and brings hope and fulfillment through God's legacy of God's people on earth. You know, one of the titles that is strongly used in Matthew's gospel, more so than the other gospels, is the phrase Son of David. We sometimes hear Son of God or Son of Man in the gospels, but Son of David is kind of a unique title. Son of David is used 17 times in all four gospels, but of the 17 times, 10 of those 17 uses are in Matthew's gospel. Matthew goes out of his way to make sure that the title Jesus is connected back to that David lineage, that Jewish lineage. Jesus is not only Son of God, Son of Man, but Son of David, which I think is significant. The other piece that kind of ties in that Jewish heritage with Jesus is when Jesus talks about the law in Matthew. And more than once, he basically talks about he doesn't come to get rid of the Jewish law. He comes to fulfill Jewish law. He comes to transform the lives of people that were already believers of God, followers of God. He is simply there to transform and enrich that which already exists within their faith. It's not simply following for Jesus, following laws. Jesus there, his fulfillment of the law is deepening and cultivating a relationship with God. How important it is in Matthew's gospel is to make that distinction that the Jewish heritage isn't just following the rules. Jesus came to move beyond following the rules and getting to a place where people want to dig deep who God is, why I believe in God, and how I can commit myself to this deeper relationship with God. Messiah language, or the illusion of Messiah language in Matthew's gospel, can be found in all 28 chapters of that gospel. This length of gospel, this 28 chapters, Matthew ensures throughout language, either directly or indirectly, is helping us see Jesus as Messiah, either in terms of being pointing out as Messiah or the embodiment of Jesus as Messiah throughout the gospel. The other thing that's interesting in Matthew's gospel, can be found in the other gospels as well, but strongly in Matthew's gospel, is that many times when Jesus teaches a crowd, he is teaching in the synagogue. He is teaching in a place that's known to him, that's commonplace for him. When he moves to a new town, he finds the synagogue and teaches in the synagogue. That's where the Jewish people are. When they gather together as community, they're in the synagogue. And so Jesus gathers where the community is. He gathers in that synagogue location, that holy, sacred place for them, and he teaches many times in a synagogue setting, which would have enhanced or enriched that idea of Jesus' Jewish character. The other thing is, throughout the gospel, in addition to Son of David, a title I've already mentioned, there's many times Jesus is simply mentioned as teacher or rabbi. A title given to him is a very Jewish title. So all these are kind of hints, or either directly or indirectly, of this Jewish character we find in Matthew's gospel. The other quality about this gospel in this opening session I want to highlight is how the Gospel of Matthew is organized and how it's put together. And every gospel has its own kind of structure in the way it's formulated and put together. And I would dare say that Matthew's gospel and the way it's put together is put together in a very rabbinical or teaching format. Matthew's gospel is unique in how it's put together. There are I guess the best way to do this is I'm going to put a slide on the screen that I want you to see. And this slide that you're going to see is a slide that shares the structure of Matthew's gospel. And it's kind of put together by two scholars by the name of Ellis and Lohr. And you will see on that slide that there are places, and I have on that slide places that are bolded text, and there are 5 lines there that are bolded. And those bolded texts are discourses or significant teaching moments that Jesus has throughout the gospel. And this is unique. The other 3 gospels in the New Testament do not have this structure. But these teaching discourses become significant teaching discourses spread out through the gospel. There are 5 of them. There's a discipleship teaching, a sending out teaching, a story teaching, a living in the community teaching, and a judgment teaching. And these 5 discourses are taught in a very rabbinical format. And so the format of the gospel takes on as though the gospel itself is very rabbi-like in its structure. And so as you look at the structure of this gospel, you will notice that each of these discourses does something important. Each discourse, its teaching by Jesus, is meant to embody the ministry of Jesus. Each discourse is meant not only to be believed, but to be lived. And each discourse gradually models what it means to be a disciple of Jesus, personally, communally, and eternally. The 5 discourses that are in the gospel appear in this way. The first one is what we know is the Sermon on the Mount. It's chapters 5 through 7. The mission discourse is chapter 10. The parable discourse is chapter 13. The community discourse is chapter 18, and the judgment discourse toward the end is chapters 23 through 25. When you add up the 5 discourses together, the amount of material of the 28 chapters, those 5 discourses represents 32% of the gospel. And that means 1/3 of the gospel are these 5 teaching moments of Jesus. And the teaching moments lead into the living out of those things. There's this progressive quality of these rabbinical teaching moments that shape and give direction to the entire gospel. If you take out those 5 discourses, you lose so much of what Matthew is trying to teach us about Jesus as Messiah, Jesus with his Jewish heritage, and most importantly, what we believe about Jesus and how we live what we believe about Jesus. So I hope in this first session today you've kind of got a little bit of an idea of the direction that we're going. The last 5 sessions of this series will dive into each of those 5 discourses. And we'll do one session for each discourse. And each discourse is meaty, has lots of information to explore and reflect on. And so we will be doing that over the next 5 weeks. So I hope you will continue to join us for this study of Matthew's gospel and the rabbinical qualities of this gospel as we learn what Matthew has to teach us and to inspire our faith and to learn more about the content of what Matthew has to share for us. So thank you for being here today and look forward to seeing you in session 2.